The Ferris wheel was still spinning when the world fractured. On the warm August evening of 1994, the scent of cotton candy danced on a summer breeze, laughter scattered beneath pastel-striped tents, and somewhere near the edge of the Marion County Fairgrounds, a mother's voice echoed unanswered. 10-year-old Amy Mihalcik was supposed to return before sundown, her penny-colored braids bouncing as she darted past lemonade stands and carousel horses. But as dusk bled into night, Amy was nowhere to be found. Her name would soon become a whisper through cornfields, a ghost step across Ohio's heartland, and the center of a case that would remain as cold as the soil beneath Wilshire Cemetery. This was not just a disappearance. This was a vanishing that fractured a town's innocence and left behind only shadows, silence, and one unanswered question: how does a little girl vanish in the middle of a crowd? The search began before the moon had settled over the fields. Flashlights bobbed like fireflies through the tall grass, calling her name into the wind, into dark woods and drainage ditches, into nothing. Local volunteers, sheriff's deputies, even strangers from neighboring counties came with dogs and hope stitched into their jackets. But every corner turned brought the same chilling answer: silence. Inside the Mihalcik home, Amy's mother clutched the shirt her daughter had worn the day before, rocking slowly in a corner where the walls felt closer than breath. Time lost meaning. An hour felt like days, and in those first agonizing hours, no one yet knew what would be found or what wouldn't, because by morning the fairgrounds would be empty. But Amy's absence would grow louder, thicker, more impossible to ignore. It wasn't just that she was missing, it was that she had vanished like dew under sunrise, without footprint, without sound, without goodbye. Just before midnight, Detective Harold Keene stood alone at the entrance to the animal barns, cigarette burning down unnoticed between his fingers. A veteran of 19 years, he had seen runaway teens and broken homes, family fights and false alarms, but nothing felt like this. It was the way the cotton candy stand still had bowls half full, the way the carousel horses froze in mid-gallop, their painted grins now sinister in the moonlight. Someone, he thought, had walked out of here with her. Not run, walked. Calmly, quietly. It was the only explanation that fit the terrifying neatness of the scene. No witnesses. No struggle. No scream. As the fair's laughter faded permanently into memory, Keene's gut began to churn. Someone who knew this place. Someone who planned. And someone who might already be preparing to vanish again, just like Amy. The clock struck 12, and for the first time since the 911 call, the town of Marion felt contaminated not just with fear, but with the creeping certainty that a predator had been hiding among them all along. 16 hours later, the sun rose over Marion like it didn't know, as if light could ignore what darkness had done. On the morning of August 8th, the fairgrounds were cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered in the wind like torn prayer flags. Forensics teams walked slowly, respectfully, among overturned popcorn buckets and forgotten carnival toys. One child's left shoe, a red canvas sneaker, was found near the east fence. It wasn't Amy's, but it was enough to quiet the crowd of reporters now gathering along Main Street, where every mother's eyes carried both relief and guilt. Relief that it wasn't their child, guilt that someone else's now bore the nightmare. At St. Vincent's School, Amy's empty desk was draped in a white rose, and the chalkboard still held the birthday countdown she'd drawn. 9 days left. One of her classmates, a boy named Caleb, wouldn't speak for weeks. He just kept sitting by the swings, waiting. Her backpack, her drawings, the glint of her retainer case on the bathroom sink, they were all still there, waiting too. Amy's father, Tom Mihalcik, hadn't cried in public, not yet. A tall, stoic man with hands like worn leather and eyes that had seen too many grain seasons pass before calling this one the worst. He stood outside their home as news vans idled like carrion on the corner. His voice stayed calm for the cameras, but inside his chest, his heart clawed like a trapped animal. He kept replaying that last moment, her waving over her shoulder, face sticky with snow cone syrup, promising to be back before the fireworks. A promise that word echoed in his bones. She had never broken a promise. Not to him. Not ever. That was what disturbed him most. If Amy hadn't come back, he believed she couldn't. Even now, as neighbors left lasagna and condolence wrapped in plastic, Tom kept sharpening his tools in the garage not out of need, but to keep from unraveling. He didn't say it aloud, but he already knew. Whoever had taken Amy walked among them, breathed the same air, maybe even nodded hello that morning. And that truth weighed heavier than grief. On the third night, the storm rolled in. Thunder cracked like a judge's gavel, and rain fell in sheets over the town that wouldn't sleep. In the Mihalcik living room, the family Bible lay open on the coffee table, untouched since Amy's baptism, the flame in the prayer candle fighting the drafts like a final heartbeat. But no divine answer came. Instead, Detective Keene stood beneath the flickering bulb in the police station's break room, drowning his exhaustion in vending machine coffee, eyes locked on a map of the fairgrounds covered in red pins and cold coffee stains. He wasn't just chasing shadows now, he was being followed by them. Behind every tip was a dead end. Every face in the photo album began to blur with suspicion. He circled names, crossed others off, but one kept resurfacing in the margins: Clint Harper, a groundskeeper, quiet, barely noticed. Suspended once years ago for inappropriate conversation with a minor at a county fair. No charges. No follow-up. Just a whisper in a dusty file. Keene stared at the name until it pulsed. Cold cases never start cold. They cool slowly, like blood on concrete. Clint Harper's trailer sat at the edge of the fairgrounds, a rusted husk surrounded by wild clover and forgotten tools. On the fourth morning, as a gray mist curled above the fields, Keene knocked once, then again, the echo swallowed quickly by silence. Nobody answered. But the curtain flicked. It was just enough. With a warrant in hand and the weight of a child's absence pressing in from all sides, officers entered. The inside smelled like motor oil and damp wood. Dolls lined a shelf above the sink, none of them Amy's, but all unnervingly similar. In a drawer, a wristwatch with a rainbow charm, cracked face frozen at 6:13 p.m. Next to it, a Polaroid camera and a stack of blank films, some used, negatives burned. Then, Keene saw it. On the back of a calendar, a list scribbled in pencil, county names, event dates, and beside them, tiny code marks, past fairs. Other towns. Other little girls. The storm outside began to clear. But inside, the air turned leaden, because this was no longer about one child gone. This was about a pattern, a predator, and a timeline stretching far beyond Marion. Back at the station, Keene slammed the evidence drawer shut, the sound ricocheting off tiled walls like a gunshot in a tomb. Years. It had been years. The list on that calendar stretched back nearly a decade. 13 towns, 13 fairs, and scattered between them, children who vanished like morning mist. Most were ruled as runaways, a few as accidents, but suddenly, their silences all spoke the same name. He reached for the phone, heart pounding, and called in the behavioral analysis unit. This wasn't just the work of a man with urges. This was the blueprint of someone who hunted under a veil of innocence. The kind who swept trash at fairs, handed lost children snow cones, helped fold tents at night. Keene knew the press would soon descend like crows, knew the town's already brittle heart might shatter with exposure. But he also knew this. If they didn't move fast, Amy would not be the last name on that list. Somewhere out there, another fair would open soon, another carousel would spin, and someone would be waiting calmly, quietly, again. Amy Mihalcik's case fractured more than a family. It wedged a thin crack straight through the heart of Marion itself. Every diner conversation turned hushed when her name came up, as though spoken words might summon something awful. Parents gripped their children's hands tighter at gas stations, front porches sat empty after sunset, and church pews filled with trembling prayers. Even years later, the town remembered the summer that never truly ended. The Mihalciks moved away 2 years after the fair, their house left silent, with toys still sealed in attic boxes. Detective Keene retired in 2002, but he kept Amy's case file in his study, beside a cracked photo of his own daughter. Though Clint Harper died awaiting trial in 1999, the questions never closed: how many girls, how deep the truth, and why Amy? No trace of her was ever found, only the unmatched ache her absence left behind. And in Marion, Ohio, every August feels the same, like a clock that forgot how to move forward, ticking still, waiting for a little girl who promised to come back before the fireworks. But in 2011, 17 years after the fair, a letter arrived at the Marion County Sheriff's Office. It was unsigned, scrawled in awkward, slanting lines, and postmarked from Cincinnati. She smiled at night. It read. Her voice was soft like rain. I still hear it when I sleep. The envelope contained no fingerprints, only a pressed wildflower and a photo, black and white, barely legible. But in it was a child sitting on a tire swing, legs dangling, face turned just out of focus. Detectives compared it to school pictures. The necklace, the freckle above the brow, the shape of the chin. It looked like Amy, or someone who could have been her, maybe older by a few years. The image couldn't be verified. The source was never found. But it was enough to reopen old wounds, to send Keene, now gray, quiet, and long retired, staring at corkboards again, chasing ghosts down rabbit holes lit by nothing but memory. Because maybe, just maybe, the story didn't end with silence. Maybe she grew up somewhere else, eyes full of hidden skies, still remembering fireworks that never came. By the time the letter had made its quiet journey from inbox to evidence room, a familiar ache had returned to the Marion air, part memory, part myth. A new detective, Lena Rowe, 31, with sharp intuition and childhood memories of seeing Amy's poster at every post office, took it upon herself to reopen the case file. She drove 2 hours to Cincinnati, retracing the envelope's origins, even the postbox it had likely come from, a sun-bleached corner nestled beside a used bookstore. The owners remembered nothing. There was no security footage. But Lena stayed the night in town anyway, sitting by her motel window, staring at the copy of the photo, wondering not just about Amy, but about what it meant to remember someone who may no longer remember herself. If the girl in the swing was really Amy, it meant something worse than death. It meant life, stolen. It meant memory rewritten, identity erased. It meant looking into a mirror that no longer reflected what was once a girl in ponytails, skipping through sawdust and summer light, promising to come home before the fireworks, and someone, not something, chose to rewrite her story. She wasn't the only one. Over the next 6 months, Lena Rowe uncovered a string of letters, eerily similar, each one unsigned, each one sent from different Ohio towns. Always the same handwriting, always fragments of poetry or memory. Her laugh sounded like wind in wheat, one said. Another carried an old locket with a photo inside, 2 girls at a lake, faces blurred, arms around each other. Facial recognition proved inconclusive, but patterns began to emerge. Counties aligned with Harper's calendar. Dates matched events where no clear crimes were ever officially recorded, but where whispers lingered. Missing reports altered, names redacted, one case dismissed on grounds of custodial interference, though no custody battle ever existed. Lena traced it all: closed doors and faded ink, scraps of forgotten children scattered across the Midwest. Again and again she returned to one line in the earliest letter. She smiled at night. Someone was watching. Not just then, but now. And as the red string spread across her office wall like veins, Lena finally realized Marion was just the beginning. Amy wasn't a single case. She was chapter 1 of a book someone was still writing, page by unholy page. In the winter of 2012, Lena stood before the frost-lined window of the old Mihalcik home, now abandoned and hollow, its walls silent witnesses to yesterday's screams. The town had long let the house decay, ivy threading across broken boards like veins of grief turned wild. Inside, dust motes spun like memories, and atop the mantel still sat a faded photo of Amy with a sun hat, blinking against August glare. Lena wasn't there for closure. She was there for a beginning. Among the documents she had gathered, one name kept reappearing: a retired carnival electrician named Harold Slink, last seen working in counties eerily close to Harper's Trail, yet never investigated. He had gone off-grid in 1996, right after the last confirmed sighting of a missing girl. Harper may have been the hand, Lena thought. But what if someone else was the architect? As snow began to fall outside, quiet as withheld confession, Lena slipped the photo of the swing into her coat pocket. Somewhere beneath Ohio's frozen silence, stories were still buried unfinished, unrevealed, and one of them, she knew now, still had Amy's name written in it, waiting for the final page. In the spring of 2013, Lena traveled to a riverside junkyard near Ironton, Ohio, following a tip, buried deep in an archived utilities report, one that mentioned an unlicensed camper pulling illegal voltage from a decommissioned line. There, among rusting trailers and the skeletal remains of old rides, she found the shell of a carousel horse hollowed by rain, and behind it, the remains of a small generator shack painted circus red. A crowbar pried the lock. Time peeled back like bark. Inside were records-worn notebooks, filled with sketches of fair maps, instructions written in tight cursive, and checklists divided into two columns: approach and depart. Lena's breath caught as she flipped pages, each date darker than the last. There were names crossed out. Amy's was at the top. But closer to the end, written fresher, was a name no one had mentioned, not in 20 years. Emily Lance. Disappeared, 1993, just one town west. That case was ruled an accident. Until now. Everything tied back. Circles always bled together. Harper was the mask, but not the voice. Somewhere out there, Lena understood, the storyteller was still writing. And for Amy Mihalcik, the last page had not yet turned. The summer of 2014 brought no answers, only the rustle of old ghosts and the slow churn of unearthed truths. In a borrowed county storage unit, Lena arranged everything: the notebooks, the letters, the faded photos, the calendar, the locket, the maps. Every piece was a breadcrumb, each soaked with silence. But buried beneath the paper and grief was one final item she hadn't noticed before: a cassette tape, unmarked, tucked into a carnivalesque tin once used for tickets. She borrowed an old player from the evidence locker, pressed play, and heard nothing at first. Then, faintly, a child's voice humming, broken but familiar, like a lullaby remembered sideways, followed by a man's voice, low, rehearsed. "You're safe now, you're loved," and then static. Lena sat unmoving as the tape rewound. This wasn't confession. It was a message, maybe even a goodbye, or a beginning. Somewhere, someone had tried to speak across time's great silence. And as Lena looked out across an Ohio sky bruised with twilight, she no longer wondered whether Amy was alive. She wondered what story Amy had lived if she had become someone, somewhere, with a name she never chose, still waiting for one firework that never came. It would be another 3 years before a break disrupted the quiet. In 2017, a Jane Doe was found in a storm drain outside Dayton's Small Bones. Stitched denim, a broken retainer etched with a single fading star. DNA was inconclusive at first, degraded by years in runoff. But technology had grown teeth. Parabon's snapshot generated an age regression composite from mitochondrial traces, and when it was published, hearts across Ohio constricted. The eyes matched. The brow. Even the soft mouth Lena remembered from school flyers. But without full confirmation, it remained a question tragic, cruelly possible. The local coroner, shaken, wrote in his report, "If it is her, she grew older than we thought, then younger again." The line haunted Lena. She visited the grave, unmarked, save for a bouquet someone left each August. No note, just wildflowers, just like the ones in the letter. The weight of years, lost names, and stolen futures pressed into the soil like folded pages never read. But somewhere between fact and prayer, between silence and scream, One truth held fast. Amy Mihalcik's story had never stopped. It had simply changed masks. And maybe, just maybe, she was never as far as they feared, just caught in a world that spun too fast, like a carousel frozen mid-song, waiting for someone to find the key and let it turn once more. By 2020, Lena Rowe had transferred to the State Division, burned out from years of circling the same shadows, yet incapable of letting Amy go. On quiet nights in her new office, she still traced inked red paths across old fairground maps with trembling fingers, whispering Amy's name like a rosary. But the closer she looked, the more she saw it not a disappearance, but a ritual. Every town, every date, each tethered to a mythos deeper than one man's sickness. There were others involved. She suspected faceless names that had moved silently through rusting carnivals and summer parades, coordinated like smoke. She began interviewing old workers, most long buried in state records or anonymized in death. One, a roustabout named J.D.D. Kilmer, terminally ill and tired of secrets, whispered it on his last breath. Harper didn't pick the girls. He gathered them. His eyes glistened with a freight too long carried. For who? Lena asked, but he was already gone. And in that silence, a new question rose. What if Amy hadn't just vanished, or been taken, or rewritten? What if she had been chosen, not for who she was, but for what she represented? A symbol, a story, an opening chapter in a book still being read by eyes hidden in the dark. And somewhere in Ohio, another summer was beginning. The carousel was creaking slowly back to life, and a little girl's name whispered again against cornfields and dusk. Amy, 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 still waiting for someone to finally turn the last page. That summer, Lena stood again at the Marion County Fairgrounds. Now quiet, the laughter long gone, the ghosts louder than ever. Grass pushed through the cracks in the pavement. The carousel sat rusted, the horses chipped and still. She held the page from Harper's calendar in her hand, the ink now faded to the color of dry blood. Next to Amy's name, faint but legible, was a single star. Lena looked around slowly. This was where it all began. Not in the moment Amy disappeared, but in whatever breath was held just before. She closed her eyes. Somewhere out there, maybe in another county, another ride would hum to life. Another girl would skip towards twilight, unless the story finally stopped. Unless someone stopped it. With every case connected, every shadow illuminated, and every name rewritten into history, Lena had come to see the truth. The answers weren't only buried in the past, they were being lived by the future. And as dusk painted the sky violet, and the fairgrounds sighed beneath memory's weight, Lena whispered to the wind, not a prayer, not a farewell, but a promise. No more beginnings, only endings. And maybe, at last, peace. Yet peace, like justice, is a fragile thing and seldom silent. In 2021, an anonymous tip arrived through the State Missing Persons Network. A woman in rural Pennsylvania claimed that her elderly neighbor, who had recently passed away, once confessed to helping hide a girl from Ohio years ago during the fairs. The lead was thin, frayed by time and grief, but something in Lena stirred again. She traveled east, stood in the shadow of a crumbling cabin nestled between birch trees and brush, and found an attic locked behind rusted hinges. Inside were remnants, a faded flannel blanket, the iron smell of age, and etched into the floorboards, the initials A.M., dated 1995. Dust stirred around her boots, like the breath of history. Lena knew then. Somewhere along Amy's path, people had risked everything to protect, not possess. Maybe not everyone who touched her did so to harm. Perhaps she had been carried, hidden, saved if only for a time. The truth may never wear one face, but stories leave fingerprints, and Lena vowed to follow them until the very end, wherever that final page may be. Because Amy Mihalcik was not forgotten. She was still whispering, still waiting, and now, at last, someone was still listening. In the spring of 2022, Lena stood before the State Archives building in Columbus, wind stirring her coat as she prepared to open sealed documents, newly unclassified under Ohio's Freedom of Information reform. Inside were case files, previously inaccessible affidavits from undercover agents placed near state fairs in the late 1990s, reports of suspected trafficking rings that went quiet just before Harper's arrest, anomalies that had never been tethered to Amy. Then she found it. A handwritten memo by a retired federal liaison describing an operation labeled Starfall, aimed at dismantling a traveling network suspected of using carnival routes for non-consensual transport across state lines. The lists matched Lena's map, but more chilling was the final line of the memo. Primary subject: female minor, Midwestern origin. Possible relocation success. Final status: unknown. Amy. She may have survived the first vanishing only to be swept up into something larger, systemic, deliberately silenced. The truth was no longer about one girl lost in carnival dusk. It was about a hidden machinery that buried its stories deep beneath nostalgia, laughter, and the false innocence of Americana. And as Lena stepped back into light, the building behind her heavy with still-sealed stories, she knew the case wasn't cold. It had only ever been quiet, and somewhere, the hum of a carousel still waited to begin its song anew, until someone had the strength to finally shut it down forever. By the late summer of 2022, Lena found herself on a lonely county road outside Chillicothe, driving past fields that shimmered gold in the fading light, toward one last address: a former church converted years ago into storage by the faded skin of traveling carnivals. There, tucked between crates of rusted ride parts and canvas tenting that still smelled faintly of popcorn and dust, she discovered a notebook, brittle with age. It wasn't catalogued. It wasn't official. It was personal, a diary of sorts, fragmented, beginning midline. I was told my name was Sarah, but it didn't fit. Page after page bore the handwriting of what could only be a teenage girl, remembering flashes of Ohio, cornfields, a fair, a stuffed bear with a missing button, a man with a soft voice who turned sharp when the lights went out, and one repeated mantra: "They said I was lucky to be chosen, but I remember being lost." Only at the end, shakily, was it signed, Amy. Lena held the pages against her heart like ashes of a fire long buried. It wasn't closure. It wasn't justice, but it was truth, scorched and fragile, and finally spoken. After nearly 3 decades of silence, a voice had returned, not as a ghost, but as a girl who had never stopped searching for herself. And as the sun fell behind the trees, the sky lit up soft and gold, and Lena whispered into the stillness, "You're not lost anymore." The story of Amy Mihalcik did not end in a grave, nor in a folder tucked into the back of a locked cabinet. It lived on in the words of one girl who refused to forget her name, in the footprints Lena traced across county lines, in every small voice that trembled into a world too large and often too cruel. It lived in the carousel that finally, after years of silence, was dismantled and sent to rust behind locked fences, never again to spin for those who hunted behind painted smiles. A state report closed that same autumn listed her as presumed deceased. But Lena never accepted those words. Neither did the people who left wildflowers each August. Amy's name now stands etched on a quiet memorial outside Marion, beside a statue of a child reaching toward a fading sky, not as a tragedy, but as a vow. To always listen when the wind changes, to always look into the shadows when the laughter's too sweet, and to never forget that sometimes the most haunting stories are not those left unsolved, but those told piece by piece until a girl becomes real again, not as a memory, but as a voice finally heard in full daylight. And perhaps in the end, that was what Amy Mihalcik became, a voice, not echoing from the void, but rising from beneath years of silence to remind us what is lost when stories are buried instead of told. Her name now lives not in police reports or faded flyers, but in the folds of a greater reckoning, a shift in how we see the world behind the painted lights and summer banners. Because for every forgotten child, there must be a voice that refuses to forget. For every crack in the system, someone must insist on looking closer. Lena left the badge behind eventually, but not the work. She joined a small network of advocates tracking unlinked disappearances across the Midwest, hand in hand with survivors sharing pieces of their unknown pasts. And in those stories, Amy's story kept showing up not always in name, but in spirit. The girl who never returned before the fireworks did not vanish without meaning. She shattered the illusion that safety is passive. She became the light someone followed back home through the dark. And maybe that, in the most haunted corners of memory, is the only true ending worth writing. A child once lost, now found, not in body, but in voice, in purpose, and in the promise that no fairground will ever hide another child in the sound of its laughter again. Years later, when Lena Rowe could no longer chase cases across state lines, when headlines had faded and Ohio's skies had turned over to younger watchers, she found herself standing once more at the edge of the Marion County Fairgrounds. The grass was taller now, trees thicker, the carousel finally torn down to its skeleton frame. But the ghosts lingered, as they always would. In her hand, Lena held the last ribbon Amy had worn, found folded into the pages of the notebook discovered in Chillicothe, a faded pink, worn thin from time and touch. She tied it gently to the rusted gate, not as a memorial, but as a marker that once, in this place, a child's story was reclaimed from silence. That day, no speeches were given, no plaques unveiled, just the wind moving through the fields, like a whisper finally set free. And in that haunting quiet, as sun filtered through worn clouds and memory, Lena didn't hear screams or sorrow anymore. She heard a girl laughing, soft as summer, not in fear, but in freedom. And it was enough. Somewhere, tucked deep in the corners of the Ohio wind, there are still people who remember her. Amy Mihalcik, not as a case file or a mystery, but as a child with freckles, a swing that creaked at dusk, a smile too bright to vanish. Her story, once fragmented across time and silence, now runs like a vein through those who carry its weight, people like Lena, who traded her badge for belief, and the others who followed the trail she blazed. What began as a disappearance became a reckoning, a mirror turned upon a nation that had too long let its children vanish between the frames of festival lights. And although Amy's voice was almost taken, her story now lives in classrooms that teach vigilance, in policies that demand answers, and in every fairground where a parent grips their child's hand tighter, unwilling to ever let go. For in the end, Amy was never truly lost. She was waiting for someone to see her. Really see her. And now, after silence, after sorrow, after all the days where nothing moved but memory, she has been seen. Finally, endlessly seen. Long after Lena Rowe's footsteps faded from the cracked asphalt of the fairgrounds, Amy's memory remained etched in the marrow of Ohio's forgotten places, abandoned cotton candy stalls, faded murals of smiling clowns, rusted bolts where swings once turned in the light. Her story, once too painful to name, settled into a different kind of legacy. A living one. In 2025, legislation passed, bearing her name, the Mihalcik Act, mandating background checks for all traveling fair employees and creating a permanent division within the state's Bureau of Investigation focused on carnival-linked disappearances. Survivors came forward from places no one expected, drawn by the echo of a story finally told. They remembered colors, names, lullabies, bits of broken childhood barely clinging to memory's edge. Each voice added light to Amy's name. And in Marion, where her smiling bronze statue now skips in permanent twilight beside a swing that will never again be empty, passers-by slow, not from sadness, but reverence. Because in the end, Amy did not disappear into silence. She returned as a voice that outlasted evil, as proof that even the smallest spark of truth can set fire to darkness, and as a child whose name, once whispered in fear, is now spoken aloud with fierce, enduring love. Some stories begin with a vanishing, others end in a voice. Amy Mihalcik's journey became both the ache between what was lost and the strength found in remembering. 30 years after her disappearance, her name no longer lingers in secrecy, but stands carved into justice, policy, and the cautious hope of parents who now walk county fairs with wider eyes and closer hands. The darkness that once cloaked her fate has been threaded with light, each revelation a stitch pulling her memory into collective truth. And though we may never know every detail of the path she walked after the fair, how many doors closed behind her, how many names she answered to before finding her own again, one truth remains undimmed by time or silence. Amy was never just a cold case. She was a seed buried deep in Ohio soil, grown now into legacy. Not an ending, but a beginning. And as wind stirs the fields near Marion each August, it doesn't carry sorrow anymore. It carries her name, soft and constant, like laughter returning from a long sleep. Somewhere tonight, at a county fair cloaked in neon and illusion, a little girl's footsteps echo between the tents, her laughter braided into the music of a carousel that forgot how to stop. Amy Mihalcik exists now not as absence, but as remembrance, a permanent chord in the American conscience, threading caution through every cotton candy kiss and every parent's instinctive glance toward dusk. Her story does not need a full solution to hold power, because in its retelling, we found not only the trail of darkness, but the resilience of light. Through Lena Rowe's unwavering pursuit, through every breath spoken in Amy's name, the silence cracked open wide enough for truth to begin its climb. And though justice may never wear the face we imagined, its presence lingers in policy, in protection, and in the way we now listen more closely to the quiet. Amy never returned before the fireworks, but her voice has outlasted smoke, memory, and fear. It dances now, forever, in the light. And so the story ends not in silence, but in resonance. The girl who was once reduced to a name on a poster became the echo that changed laws, shattered illusions, and reshaped how a community breathes through grief. Amy Mihalcik's legacy is not a tale of loss alone, but of voices found, truths unearthed, and the enduring grace of a memory that refused to be buried. Today, her story is taught, not only as tragedy, but as transformation. At the entrance of the newly rebuilt Marion County Fairgrounds, a plaque reads, "For Amy, and every child who didn't return, we see you now." Behind it, wildflowers grow unchecked, like the memories time could not erase, and every August, a group of children gather beneath her statue laughing, free, and forever safe, under a sky that remembers. Because Amy's story was never just about what was taken. It was always about what would one day be returned. Her voice, her presence, her name, bright as fireworks, etched into eternity. In the end, what began as a vanishing at twilight became the story that taught a town, a state, and a nation how to see in the dark. Amy Mihalcik's light flickers not in fairy tale endings but in lanterns held high by those who remain investigators, survivors, lawmakers, parents, each of them carrying a fragment of the truth she left behind. Her name, stitched into law and whispered in lullabies, has transcended tragedy. And though we may never trace her exact steps beyond that fairground dusk, her impact moves forward through every child found, every mother believed, every shadow turned toward the sun. The carousel has stopped, but the story still turns circle by circle, year by year, around one name that refused to vanish. A name that speaks of loss, of fight, of healing. A name we now say not from grief, but in honor. Amy Mihalcik, lost once, never again. Amy Mihalcik's story will never be a closed book. It will remain a living testimony, a flicker in every eye that scans a fairground more cautiously, a tremor in every instinct that acts just a moment faster, a warmth in the pulse of advocacy that refuses to rest. She is the promise that no child's name should vanish beneath noise and negligence, that no story should settle into dust without being spoken. And though her journey began with a fracture at the edge of summer, it ends with the kind of restoration no monster could steal: dignity, remembrance, and the fierce, eternal persistence of truth. In every town she passed through unknowing, in every law her name strengthened, Amy lives on not as missing, but as found in the hearts of those who loved, who searched, who saw her at last. Her voice, once stolen, now sings through every effort to protect another child from fading into silence. And that, finally, is her legacy illumination in the darkness, and the enduring echo that even when one light flickers, it can guide home countless others. So when you walk through the rustling hush of the Marion fields, where the wind bends the corn in time with memory, remember what was found here, not only sorrow, but strength. Amy Mihalcik may have vanished once beneath the laughter of a festival, but she rose again in the voices that refused to forget her. Her absence built a monument no stone could hold, forged from persistence, compassion, and the aching truth that some children do not grow old, but instead grow luminous in our resolve. The carousel may have stopped, the fireworks may have faded, but her story burns on steady, unwavering, defiant. Because from one girl's fading trail, a path was lit for countless others, and as each August settles over Ohio, with its warm, golden hush, one sound always lingers, a quiet, enduring promise echoing in the breeze. You were seen, Amy. You are seen. And in that final truth that a single name can change how shadows move across an entire nation, we find the quiet revolution Amy left behind. Not a roar, not a headline, but the steady presence of vigilance passed from hand to hand, year to year. Her legacy lives not solely in story or statute, but in the hearts that refuse to grow indifferent. Somewhere, a mother clutches her child tighter beneath fairground lights. Somewhere else, a detective reopens a file at midnight, remembering why they began. These moments, small, sacred, unshakable, are the echoes of a life once thought lost. Amy Mihalcik's name is now part of the language we speak when we choose to protect the vulnerable, to listen harder, to stand where others once turned away. And though her trail began amid spun sugar and summer laughter, it ends here not in silence, but in defiant remembrance. A girl with braids who never returned before the fireworks now burns steadier than any spark. Not gone, not forgotten, simply guiding us forward. Forever. And so, with all the voices gathered, all the pieces named and held aloft, Amy Mihalcik's story concludes not with the emptiness of loss, but with the enduring power of remembrance. Her name lives now in law and legacy, in the rustle of wildflowers planted across schoolyards, in whispered lessons passed between generations. Though the fairground lights once masked her vanishing, they now illuminate a path toward a world more watchful, more awake. No longer a ghost behind the laughter, Amy is a guardian in its shadow, a soft resolve, echoing in every decision to notice the unnoticed, to shield the unseen. And as the wind carries her memory across Ohio's fields one last time, as dusk settles gently like a closing book, we do not say goodbye. We say thank you. For the courage her story gave, for the voices it unearthed, and for the promise that in every twilight, if we listen closely enough, we will hear her again, not lost, not gone, but eternal. So if you find yourself walking those quiet paths in Marion someday, let your steps fall gently, not for fear, but for reverence. Let them echo not just for Amy Mihalcik, but for every child whose laughter was stolen beneath the glitter of summer lights. Feel the stillness, yes, but also the strength that rose from it. Because in the places where stories were once silenced, a new kind of voice now blooms. A voice that says, we remember. A voice that insists we carry forward not just sorrow, but vigilance. And somewhere amid the hum of a county fair, where joy once masked disappearance, there is a hush. A sacred pause, filled with all that has been learned, all that has been changed. It says, we see you. We saw you. We will not forget. And so, under the weight of twilight and truth, the story of Amy Mihalcik rests not as an unanswered question, but as a compass, pointing always to the cost of indifference, to the fragility of childhood, to the weight of a promise never kept. Her name is no longer a whisper clinging to cornstalks or fading flyers curled in rain. It is a legacy inked into vigilance, a soft chorus carried on the backs of laws and lullabies, edged with grief and guilt and grace. In every flame lit on search vigils, in every policy re-examined, in every child brought safely home from the edge of vanishing, she is there. The girl who didn't return before the fireworks taught the world what it means to keep searching, to keep remembering, even when every trail goes cold. Her story has ended, yes, but only in the linear sense. In truth, it circles forever, an orbit of memory, justice, and love. And somewhere, as the carousel of time turns one more slow revolution into dusk, the breeze whispers again, not in sorrow, but in a vow: you will never vanish again. In the hush of a late Ohio summer, beneath skies soft with memory, the last page is not silence but becoming. For Amy Mihalcik was never just a name etched into stone or archived in dusty files. She became a lens through which we learned to see clearer, act quicker, love deeper. Her vanishing awakened a kind of vision that no darkness could undo. And so, in every light checked twice, in every search launched faster, in every moment a child is believed without hesitation she lives. Not just in sorrow, not only in solemn bronze or statute, but in the air itself, where laughter now shares space with remembrance. Her story may have begun in shadow, but it rises now like a sun behind fairground trees, steady, golden, watching. That, perhaps, is the true ending, not with fireworks cut too short, but with the lasting flare of vigilance born from love, the kind that never dims, the kind that forever carries her name forward. Amy. Zane. Remembered. Eternal. So as the fairgrounds fade behind time's gentle curtain, and the last light of summer bends across Marion's horizon, we close this story with not a silence, but a promise. Amy Mihalcik is not merely a girl who vanished, but a presence that insists we look harder, care deeper, and hold on longer. Her footsteps are gone from the gravel paths, but her legacy remains etched into watchful eyes, stronger policies, and hearts unwilling to forget. In every shadow cast by neon and nostalgia, her light flickers quietly, reminding us that the stories we carry are only lost if we leave them unheard. And though no final word can undo what was taken, nor restore what was stolen, we end with this truth. Amy was found not in body, perhaps, but in meaning, in justice, and in the countless children her story will protect. And that, in this quiet twilight stretched wide across Ohio's hills, is where she'll always be waiting, watching, and finally, forever home.